Testing, testing, 1, 2, 3. I am your host, David Millington, the Director of Education for Next Level Purchasing Association. And I would like to personally thank you all for joining today's webinar on supply chain social responsibility. Very, very interesting and increasingly important and critical subject for supply chain operations and supply chain and procurement professionals. With that said, I'm sure many of you all are aware of our course, Exemplary Supply Chain Social Responsibility. Now, I want to double check and make sure that my sound is coming through clearly. If there's some issue, let me know. Everything seems to be correct and good on my side. If there's some issue, if you could send me a note, I'll deeply appreciate it. So with that said, our course on exemplary supply chain social responsibility is a very, very, very in-depth and well expertly configured course, and that goes through and touches on many of the critical components of the awareness and the identification of how companies could leverage a good social responsibility program and the positive impacts and effects that can be realized from embarking on such an endeavor. And I would like us to start at a point of reflection. On your screen, we see the aftermath of a situation that occurred a few years ago in Bangladesh, where it was a complex that held many small clothing factories. This complex was responsible for the manufacture of clothes that are purchased and bought on the market in many developing countries. And when we look at this, it's a sad situation. About 1,100 people had lost their lives. And I would like to start off here. So this way we reflect internally, and we reflect on all of the components of our supply chain, and we ponder and reflect and see where we could find opportunities to improve our operations and to ensure that our supply chains are socially responsible, as is the part of the procurement mandate, which is to support our operations, manage spend, but to also protect our organizations from risk. And that mindset should be extended to the public at large, to protect our consumers and those who purchase and use our products, and our employees and all of the employees and customers in the supply chain, internal and external customers, to protect them from situations like this. And it's a critical component of managing risk in the supply chain, which is part of the threefold procurement function mandate. So we get into the question of what is social responsibility? And the short form of this, because it's a very, very, very intricate and complex field. And to be brief, social responsibility is where it's a concept in which a company or an organization would take responsibility for the social and environmental effects of its business operations. So again, a company or an organization would take responsibility for the social and environmental effects of its business operations. And we have to think about our business operations not in a siloed manner, but in a very, very holistic and complete manner, and which would extend from our suppliers, our customers, and all of the internal mechanisms that make up the supply chain. And we, gone are the days where if something goes wrong with our product or service, if there's some negative impact or some sort of ecological or social disaster as a result of the utilization of our products, gone are the days where we could say, oh, well, the fault was with our suppliers. Okay, so the modern mindset is that we are supposed to know about and to be aware and to have mechanisms of control and to have significant degrees of control of the activities, all of the activities in the supply chain, including our suppliers. So with that said, we have to be mindful, and we have to be aware, and we have to understand and to put in place effective supplier selection mechanisms and know who we are dealing with, because the rules have changed, and social media platforms bring a heightened degree of awareness and exposure to brand damage and brand image to our organization. So we have to be very aware of the suppliers that we select, and we have to also be aware of their suppliers as well. So again, and I can't reiterate this enough, gone are the days where we could blame a supplier and put all of the onus or the pressure on a supplier to come up with an effective answer as to why something went wrong. Why was there some type of ecological disaster? Why was this is a situation where our customers end up being injured or hurt in some disastrous way by utilization of our products? So we're going to be responsible as well. So we have to be aware of this heightened mindset of the modern customer. And also, we have to be aware that our customer requirements, and in several of our webinars, I mentioned that we have to be aware of our customer requirements. And we have to be aware that, yes, there are laws that govern activities, supply chain activities, but then we also have to be aware of our customer requirements and to determine if there's some gap relative to the pertinent laws that exist. In other words, our customers could have requirements that supersede those laws, and the best organizations who meet customer requirements in a very robust way, those are the organizations that would have the lion's share of the market share. So it comes down to really understanding our customer requirements and to ensuring that our suppliers and our process and internal capabilities are aligned with and capable of delivering on those customer requirements. Very, very important. So, as mentioned before, social responsibility has to be part of all of the functions in the supply chain, and that includes the procurement function and the incoming logistics functions. And again, it applies to our suppliers and our suppliers. So all of those are critical touch points in the supply chain must be under the umbrella of social responsibility. So it's not a standalone program, and it should we shouldn't, as professionals, we should not try to go it alone. It should be part of a very integrated, supported program that has buy-in at the most senior level. it's very important that we understand that, and it is going to, in order for a social responsibility program to succeed, it's going to require great negotiating, persuading, and sourcing skills to ensure that we, number one, select suppliers who are capable, and we select suppliers who are willing to buy in and to be strategically aligned. So part of the critical criteria for selecting suppliers should be that they have the capability. We understand their positions, we understand their interests, and we have to make sure that those positions and those interests of our suppliers and their suppliers are aligned with our strategic objectives and our social responsibility strategic objectives. So it is very important that that we get buy-in from top management, and they're involved and they champion the social responsibility cause, and that again that we don't attempt to go it alone. And we have to understand that in the long run, yes, we may find suppliers that are socially responsible, and we find suppliers that are aligned, and in the short run, the price points may come in a little bit higher, but in the long run, we would be in a position, by having an effective social responsibility program, we'll be in a position in which we would again safeguard our organizations from potential risk and brand damage, and protect our customers at large. We'll be avoiding those costs. So in the long run, dealing with suppliers and selecting only suppliers that have the capability, and I use the word capability, to be socially responsible and to be to the level in which our customer requirements dictate. In the long run, dealing with suppliers, only with suppliers who have that capacity, in the long run, it would be cheaper to procure from such sources. And we have to have a degree of vision, and a good balance of vision, and we have to be realistic as to the parameters that we would encounter. And we also, in terms of the do's and don'ts, and of the effective vision for a social responsibility program, would require change management acumen, and the understanding that once we look at all the stakeholders and the key players in our supply chain operations, there may be points where we meet resistance to change, and we have to be equipped and ready to effectively manage change, and to understand that, on the same hand, to understand that change, that resistance to change, is something that is normal, and we have to be prepared to effectively manage that. That's why I mentioned that strong negotiation skills is a critical part of the ultimate success of a social responsibility program. Because once people hear, it's unfortunate, you talk about social responsibility, you talk about quality enhancement, and you don't be surprised if you have many stakeholders who would respond, well, is that going to increase the cost? And we also have to, do our due diligence as procurement professionals to analyze and understand the cost of not being socially responsible, and the cost of not having good quality products, because low quality products and poor quality products also have some other impacts. Lack of efficiencies also have impacts, and we could go on and on with that in terms of rework and lack of first pass yield and other costs associated. excessive transportation and motion, and the impact that these elements of waste have on our environments. So we have to, again, look at social responsibility in a very, very holistic way and be prepared if we have the intentions of setting up such a program in our organizations. We have to be prepared to deal with change and resistance to change. So it's quite easy for us to think that lack of social responsibility and issues, or lack of, how should I put it, environmental consciousness, negative environmental impacts, child labor, etc. Only these are matters that only relate to developing countries. This is farthest from the truth. If we were to Google sweatshops in any country, we would see, even developed countries, we would see that you may get a rude awakening. For example, sweatshops in the United States, it had gotten over 114,000 hits on Google. So yes, they're more likely to be a phenomenon in developing countries, this lack of social responsibility, but they are also present in countries as well. And there is a correlation between lower gross domestic product, lower GDP, and a higher score on the corruption index. And corruption, again, does also have negative impact on the degree of social responsibility. So some areas of concerns at suppliers and the suppliers that we deal with. Again, our job, our function, the procurement function, to put it very, very, very simply, is to ensure the supply, the reliable supply of mission critical inputs to our conversion processes. And we are responsible for ensuring that those mission critical inputs are free from any degree of risk. And risk could be viewed from many dimensions, and including brand damage. Because at the end of the day, if we have or receive inputs to our conversion processes that are subpar, and our internal capacity to ensure that converted materials or products that are realized from such processes, if we don't have the internal capabilities to ensure that the resulting outputs or products would not cause some type of harm to our organization, and in the processing of such inputs would not result in some type of negative ecological or environmental impact, if we just don't have those capabilities in-house, then we put our organizations and we put our customers, our consumers at risk. So ensuring that our suppliers are capable of delivering high quality, mission critical inputs to our processes is a critical part of our function. And we have to make sure that our suppliers are in compliance. So areas of concern, there are many areas of concern, and we could go at length with this issue of our suppliers as we ponder and reflect on how it relates to social responsibility. And one of these areas is labor, coerced labor or uncoerced labor. Coerced labor of children or adults could even go as far as slavery. So we have to ponder and reflect. The more complex our product lines are, the more complex our supply chains are, Some supply chains could have thousands upon thousands of components, and we have to understand each component, the origin of each component, and what constitutes all of the inputs, and what constitutes the sources and the processes that relate to each one of those inputs that we use in our processes. We have to understand them. It's a critical part that we procure. Was this really, is there a possibility that if we go further upstream in our supply chain to our supplier's supplier, is there some element of slavery or forced labor in that supply chain that can be attached to these components? No, we have to be able we have to have a 100% confidence level that the answer is no. So again, these are issues here. And then uncoerced child labor, worker safety, excessive overtime, and freedom to associate and to unionize. So all of these are issues that we have to understand and to reflect on, and to ensure that our supply chains are free of these type of, I would call them, ailments. So again, as we go through this exercise and this journey in this webinar today, I hope that I'm able to bring you all to critical points of reflection and action as it relates to our programs, our procurement function, and how having a social responsibility program, product line, and enhance our culture and enhance our brands. Another issue would be environmental issues: pollution, air pollution, water pollution, pollution of the land. We have heard so many cases of companies, destroying the environments, destroying the quality of the water supply. And we have heard so many, there are countless examples of situations where people in the neighboring environments of where these companies operate have high degrees of health problems and other social problems. So we have to ensure and to have the capacity to continuously audit our suppliers and make sure that these type of elements don't exist. And again, some of what I'm saying here, some of us may think, well, what is this going to cost? We have to then reflect on what is the cost of not being compliant in the long run. So we have to think, yes, in the short term, meet our short-term objectives, but we also have to think long term and think in those what-if scenarios. If our organizations get into a situation where it is revealed that some of our suppliers, they destroy the landfill, they destroy the water supply, the gross polluters of the air environments of where they manufacture our critical components, then how does that look for our brand? And God forbid that we do have some type of recall or some type of issue, some type of bodily harm as it pertains to our products, and then the investigations are done and there's a whole audit trail. Then what? So, and I would advise us all to look and to reflect on this matter of social responsibility as it's something that we should do, not as a public relations, look how good we are, but it's just the right thing to do. And if you think about pollution, and you think about air pollution, and you know, if you think about efficiencies, and if you think about, you know, in one of the webinars I mentioned that in the typical organization, 60% of the activities that are done are waste, non-value-added activities, unnecessary overproduction of buildup of inventories, unnecessary transportation, movement of materials and people, unnecessary motion in our supply chains, the generation of defects or lack of what we call first pass yield. When we think about all of these things, they drive cost. So can we have or deploy a social responsibility program and still be profitable and still have a good cost structure for our products that would make us competitive on the market? Yes. And the webinar last week, you know, we went deep into those parameters. So can we be socially responsible? Absolutely. Again, we take all these waste elements that create an overutilization of resources, the more defects that companies generate. What does this create? Right? The overutilization or overconsumption of materials. The more defects we make, and we still have to meet customer demand, it's going to create excessive production runs, right? Excessive utilization of resources and pollution. So if we're able to attack that 60% of waste in our environments, this in itself, in my opinion, would be us and organizations being more socially responsible. So we have to look at this in a very balanced way and not look at it as, oh, a program like that is going to cost money, we're going to have to raise our prices. You know, look at all of the other opportunities to save resources and to do more with less, and to do more at a cheaper price point and cost structure. And then other issues are the humane treatment of animals. Now, this, of course, will be obvious if we are in the food and cosmetics in industries. But if we're not, if we have a cafeteria in our organization, where are they getting their food supply from? And are they getting their food supply from a humane supplier? So there's so many ways that lack of social responsibility could touch our organizations. There's so many ways. And again, we have to be hyper conscious about these things because, you know, exposure, the mechanisms and the means to expose things like this via social media are very, very potent. Again, those rules have changed. So again, if we have a cafeteria in our workplace, are the suppliers to, and the suppliers of those fruit products, are they humane to animals? So we have to think about that. Our suppliers, in terms of, again, we spoke about excessive transportation, and that is and defects and inventory buildups. Are we carrying excessive inventories? Excessive inventories, a lot of times, there are other costs associated with that. Then, do we have high, in our supply chains, high defect rate, multiple, your supplier ships, you know, products to you, critical inputs, and it's 80% first pass yield, and they have to on another shipment send you the rest of the rest of what you ordered. Now that's 2 shipments. right? So that means is excessive utilization of energy, excessive carbon emissions. So you have to think about this. Again, and a lot of this goes back to how we operate and to wasting our environments and wasting our processes and the impact that these have on the environment. So we have to think about this. Our suppliers or logistics or shipping agencies, are they using trucks that are fuel efficient? Are they trucks in disrepair, or do they care? So all of these things we have to think about, you know, of who we have as partners and stakeholders in our supply chains. And I hope by now that you all are convinced that this matter of social responsibility, it's a very, very complex field and a very, very, very important area. And then there are the political and citizenship issues. Again, in many of the prior webinars, we speak about us as procurement and supply chain professionals understanding our environments and understanding that we cannot afford in the modern context, the modern supply chain and the modern procurement function context, we cannot afford to think in silos. Our organizations have landscapes and environments in which we operate. And those environments, the socio-demographic factors, the political factors, the economic factors, the technological factors, the industry factors, the customer requirements factors, and we have to understand these parameters and to be in tune to what are the current trends and what are the impacts of those trends, the potential impacts on our organizations, and how our organizations postured and positioned to deal with those trends. So as far as political issues, corruption and bribery by a supplier or by our company, conflict minerals, small and disadvantaged suppliers, and the exploitation of jobs. So we have to again, some of those critical inputs, are we getting them from is there some type of issue with conflict minerals? We have to think about that. In our supply chain, upstream and downstream, could we detect and could we measure if there's any type of bribery and corruption? All of these are questions that we have to dig deep in. And again, I started off this with critical points of reflection. And other issues, and I mentioned this before, damage or injury to customers and our employees. There are times where suppliers would give you a prototype. The first few runs of what we would have ordered meet all of the requirements, quality requirements, compliance requirements, and then to reduce cost and to increase their profitability, they change certain elements of those mission critical inputs that we procure from them. They could change some of their suppliers, they could change some of the materials. And if we have the type of relationship where we don't have the controls to protect against those issues and those occurrences, then all of a sudden, somehow there's some process change. There's some change of some of the materials that our suppliers use, and now we have a different product, and those issues go undetected in our supply chain, and goes, God forbids, it goes out to our customers or end user, and then there's some type of injury or some type of issue or some type of environmental impact. Lead paint, lead lead paint and toys, big issue. Sulfur in wallboards, another issue. So we have, these are just some of the things that we have to think about and to put in place as part of, again, part of the procurement function is to protect our organizations from risk. And I would like to extend that to protect our end users from risk. So this is part of our mandate and part of our responsibility as procurement professionals. Again, point of reflection, what do we have in place in terms of traceability, traceability mechanisms? What do we have in place to ensure with the highest degree of confidence that we are not at fault, that we're in 100% compliance as it relates to these issues? So again, be careful of unauthorized process changes from our supplier side. A lot of many big organizations would have a lot of controls. For some of the smaller and mid-sized organizations, a lot of these mechanisms could be a challenge, but we have to look at the bigger picture. If we're not compliant, and God forbid we have some type of personal or environmental negative impact, then what are the repercussions for a situation like that? So we have to look at the big picture. And then, of course, I mentioned before, damage to our company's image, reputation, and the financial potential crippling financial impact of not being compliant to social, and may I say social responsibility issues, the impact on the cost of not being compliant. How does this affect us? What is the what do you call the bigger impact or the bigger picture? So as far as mechanisms to protect and to safeguard our organizations from such a situation, we have preventative sourcing techniques, again, to error-proof, may I say, error-proof our sourcing function, to put in place and to deploy an effective supplier code of conduct, to ensure, again, as part of risk mitigation strategies, that we have robust contractual clauses, and to have internal codes of conduct, and of course, supplier audits. Again, the old adage, people would do what you monitor. So to ask and to request of our suppliers that they be conscious, socially conscious, and to be socially responsible, and to ensure that there's safeguards against many of the issues that we mentioned prior in the webinar. Just to mention this and to have it and to request it of our suppliers is not enough. To have robust and continuous audits and to embark on continuous improvement mechanisms with our suppliers is absolutely necessary to ensure that they're complying. So some of the sourcing techniques, again, try to avoid problem countries. If you know that the countries that would carry some of our mission critical inputs, if we know that there inherent problems with those areas, you may want to avoid them. The U.S. Department of Labor database, there, I put the link there. We could look to see where there all of the areas where coerced labor is something that's prominent, we could look at all of those countries and make our decisions. And as much as we can, if we could avoid the intermediaries, agents, brokers, the more where practical, if we can, with the understanding that the more organizations and entities we have in our supply chain, we have to look at it, this way, as I mentioned before, in a very holistic manner. If the more hands that we have in our supply chain, that means we'll have more processes. We have more variation of those processes. We would have an increased probability that something could go wrong somewhere. So again, if we avoid as many intermediaries as possible, we would reduce the probability of something going wrong somewhere. And again, this is easier said than done, as I mentioned, where practical. And again, as I mentioned, point of reflection, right? We analyze how we operating, and we, as part of our risk mitigation strategy, we look for potential points of failure, and we look to see where things could go wrong in our supply chain. And I'll get into that towards the end in terms of how we could enhance our operations and to be more compliant with social responsibility issues. Again, regular visits to our suppliers' facilities, and to be realistic about the power of contracts, especially if we procuring across borders. We have to be realistic. And again, this is all about pondering and reflecting on how we do things, and to look for ways and how we could simplify our operations, and how we could collaborate and partner with our key stakeholders to be compliant with many of the issues that we mentioned. And then also to, again, give our local suppliers a chance, right? As much as we can, if we, this may be a charged issue, but again, the further out we go, the longer our supply chains are, the more complex they are. There's again more transportation in our supply chain because we have longer logistical lines. We have more motion in our supply chains as well. We would have more potential for enhanced or increased pollution and emissions and carbon footprint. So we have to think about that. So if we could shorten our lines as much as possible, this could also mitigate a lot of the risk. And in terms of us being able to effectively audit, and to continuously and regularly audit our suppliers, it would make that a lot easier. Of course, having a good supplier code of conduct would be very helpful in us deploying a social responsibility program. Putting in place this mechanism would be very helpful, especially if it describes how we expect our suppliers to act. And it's usually, if we integrate this code of conduct with our contracts, it would be very, very important to have contracts as critical points of reference. I mentioned before, to be very realistic in terms of how we view contracts, and as mentioned before, the power of contracts. And we have to understand that again, if we, which is the case for shortening our supply chains, giving our local suppliers a chance. If we procure internationally, lawsuits are slow and expensive. If there's some type of issue that we may encounter. And again, visiting our suppliers on a regular basis. It's very critical, and especially to ensure that they're keeping up with their contractual agreements, and building in the cost of compliance into our landed cost. So again, looking at our total cost of ownership, and to have that type of analysis and look for opportunities where we could realize cost reduction and have a stellar social responsibility program. I think it's very important, and to do this in collaboration with key stakeholders. I mean, one of the other webinars and it's also mentioned in our 14 purchasing best practices course on commodity teams, developing and utilizing commodity teams, where we would have all the critical key stakeholders who would make decisions around those mission critical inputs in terms of quality and delivery and social responsibility, etc. Leveraging one of those teams and collaborating with them and understanding what our total cost of ownership would look like, and our landed cost of materials relative to including a effective social responsibility program, I think would be a very good best practice. So we may want to consider that. So this would also be pivotal and very important in breaking down resistance to change, as we would involve, again, the key stakeholders in our environments, our logistics leader, our production leader, our suppliers. We could involve customers in those meetings, and on that team, on a commodity team, and again, all key stakeholders, and we make those decisions, and as it relates to our function in general, and as far as social responsibility issues are concerned. I think if we do it that way, it would break down resistance to change and would enable us to realize the critical components of a social responsibility program. So again, the development of a commodity team is very important best practice that could be leveraged in this case. Of course, internal standards of conduct, walk the talk as leaders. We have to be able to walk the talk. So whatever standards we set for our suppliers, right, we have to have high standards for ourselves, and we need to ensure that there are restrictions on bribery and gift giving. Now, the matter of gift giving, again, we have to understand the cultures in which we're procuring. In some cultures, to give gifts is a noble thing, and to reject and to refuse gifts could be seen as a very erroneous insult. So we have to have that in mind. And in some environments, we have to be conscious and to be aware of accepting of gifts. How could this impact and our ability to be compliant to social responsibility matters? So again, another point of reflection. But in terms of bribery, we have to ensure that internally we have very explicit laws of governance and address of those issues. Auditing is another critical part of our toolkit to enable us to realize a good social responsibility program that is effective, that doesn't put immense fiscal burden on our organizations to deploy. So auditing is a very critical part of or critical tool in our toolkit to realize this, I would say, to realize this requirement. It is becoming a requirement for organizations to be increasingly socially responsible. So it is becoming a requirement. So auditing, again, our suppliers are not just going to necessarily do something because we say. We have to monitor and to ensure that they're compliant. So again, checking on site with our suppliers to make sure that they're meeting the laws, they're meeting the requirements of our codes of conduct, and they're meeting the requirements of our contracts, the contractual requirements in general, and as it pertains to our social responsibility program. And for some organizations, the bigger companies, could do this themselves, effective audit. And we have to think about the effectiveness and the robustness of our auditing mechanisms, especially if, God forbid, there is some issue and they look at these auditing mechanisms. We have to understand to what extent would we be, as procurement professionals, liable for the auditing procedures. So again, for big organizations, they're able to handle this audits of this nature that could be beyond legal reproach. They can handle it themselves, but for the small and the mid-size organizations, and I say this with the fact that in the US, for example, small and mid-sized companies constitute about 80% of the company base. So it's significant. So perhaps they may want to, if you're in a small or mid-sized organization, you may want to hire an auditing firm that could handle such audits effectively and efficiently, and would ensure that there's not some type of legal ramification, God forbid, of the auditing system itself. So that's a point of consideration. And of course, choosing which suppliers to audit. Some organizations have hundreds of suppliers. So again, choosing which ones to audit, I would recommend leveraging the 80/20 or the 450 rules as it pertains to that matter, with understanding the potential reality that 80% of issues, social issues as they relate to social responsibility, would come from 20% of our supplier base. So we may want to look at it that way, or 50% of those issues will come from 4% of our supplier base. So in terms of laser focus, 4% of our suppliers will drive 50% of the issues that are related to social responsibility, the political dimensions, the socio-demographic, the human dimensions, the ecological and the environmental impact dimensions. 4% of our suppliers would drive about 50% of those issues. So that's a good place to where we could mechanism that would understanding that we could use to figure out who to audit, how regularly to audit, and when to audit. Of course, yes, supplier selection. So I urge you all to ensure that your supplier selection mechanisms are robust, that you have built into your supplier selection scorecards the critical criteria of social responsibility, that you ensure that the dimensions of the ecological and the environmental impact issues, the human and socio-demographic issues built into your scorecards. So you would have, of course, the traditional price, quality, delivery, terms, etc. And then you would put in as critical criteria the social responsibility dimensions, and only select suppliers that score highly on all of their dimensions. And we have to be conscious in terms of how we weight each one of those dimensions. Would we rate price very high, and we would rate quality as low, or would you rate price, give it a high weight, a high degree of weight, and the social responsibility parameters or dimensions is very low? We have to guard against making decisions of that nature. It should be a balanced approach, and we have to be conscious and to remember that even those scorecards and how we select our suppliers, if something goes wrong and an investigation is done, we have to think on that level too. Well, how do you select these suppliers in the first place, right? And again, I'm sure we see, and we conscious enough to see how all of these dimensions correlate. Having ethical practices, making sure there's no bribery, and rethinking about how gift giving, etc., fits into all of these issues. So again, making sure that we have an effective supplier selection mechanism is very, very, very important. If we have good suppliers that are aligned to our objectives, that they're socially responsible, and they're aligned to our quality initiatives and our safety initiatives, and that they're aligned with meeting our customer requirements, then we would be in a good situation to realize an effective and robust social responsibility, supply chain social responsibility mechanism. In terms of getting started, and we're towards the end, in terms of getting started with a program of this nature, of this noble nature, I would say, we would start with making sure that we get top management to support and to buy in to such an initiative, and we get someone very senior in the organization to be the champion, and the function of that champion would be to push the initiative through, to ensure that all roadblocks are removed, to help in managing the resistance to change, and to be an enabler and a supporter to make things happen. And again, make sure we have a good supplier code of conduct, and we get key suppliers to agree. As I mentioned earlier on, one of the key, how should I say, attributes, or the key requirements would be great negotiating skills. This could all be part of the influence and ability to negotiate. Those skills are very, very important in terms of getting started, and to again build compliance in selection scorecard and give it a good and fair weight. Give it a weight where it is of significant importance, and to ensure and to guard against, make sure you have the clauses in there where suppliers cannot change or enable process change without your notification. Very important that we have those clauses in there, and we ensure that if there's a violation or breach of those clauses that they're dealt with effectively, and to make sure that we have a robust audit document, and we make sure that the audits are carried out on a regular basis, if necessary. Hire an auditing firm, and again, you do the cost-benefit analysis. Yes, this would add cost, but I also mentioned there's an ocean of cost reduction opportunities, right, sitting in our supply chain, just waiting. Some of them are what we call low-hanging fruit, right, in our supply chain to reduce cost. And we think long-term, look at the big picture, and really think about what is the potential cost of not being compliant. And we have a linkage of the procurement performance metrics. We ensure that part of the scorecard of the buying group and the leaders in the buying group, that part of the scorecard is social responsibility dynamics and the achievement of those dynamics. So the last thing I would like to leave us with is a tool that I mentioned in quite a few of the webinars, failure mode and effect analysis. I also believe I mentioned it in the prior webinar. And it's a mechanism, risk management or risk mitigation mechanism. And I think this could be very, very, very critical part of a social responsibility program. And part of the FMEA, the failure mode and effect analysis, is where we look at our product line and we look at our processes, and we look at even our suppliers, and we see where could there be some type of risk. How could something go wrong as it pertains to social responsibility dimensions, as it pertains to, for example, those ecological and environmental impacts I mentioned, the human impacts that I mentioned, the political, the bribery issues that I mentioned. How could processes, or how could we slip in such a mode of failure? And then we would think again, as I started, critical points of reflection. What are the impacts on the customers, on our customers and our organization if we were to slip into a particular mode of failure? So we ponder and reflect on that, and then we look at our supply chains, and we gather the data. How often is such and such happening, right? So the degree of occurrence, and then again, what is the severity of those impacts, and then what is the ability for us to detect such impacts? And we score the severity, we score the occurrence, and we scored the ability for us to detect any one of those dimensions on a scale of 1 to 10. And then we calculate our risk priority number, or you could rename it social responsibility risk priority number. We should, as a matter of fact, I do strongly recommend we do something like this: social responsibility risk priority number. On a FMEA matrix, failure mode and effect analysis matrix, it's called risk priority number. But we could have something use an FMEA specifically for what we call social responsibility programs, where we name that key index social responsibility risk priority number, and we look at the entire supply chain, even go as far as the suppliers, give them work to do, or we audit them as well, our suppliers, and we identify what are the current social responsibility risk priority numbers. And then we deploy, leveraging, as I mentioned before, and I hope that you see that what we were speaking about in this journey, in this webinar here, everything is very much integrated. We leverage our commodity teams, right? We leverage the collaboration of our commodity teams to do this analysis. And we leverage our commodity teams to wherever we have high risk priority numbers, again, the formula, severity times occurrence times detection. Wherever we have high risk priority numbers, what are the recommended actions? What are the projects that we deploy to reduce those social responsibility risk factors? So FMEA, a very, very, very powerful tool that we could use because, again, it makes us think about points of failure, and if they're not occurring, how they could occur. So that's the other thing in an FMEA matrix. How could we end up in a point of failure? So we may be compliant in some areas, but how could we be non-compliant? And again, what is the impact on the customer and the business? Even if a certain dimension or certain factor has a low risk priority number, right? We are aware. We have done the due diligence. We have documented this. We have thought through this. We have explored this process about what it would look like if we're in a point of failure. And then again, as part of strategic sourcing, right? And as I mentioned before, having those error-proofing mechanisms, what could we put in place to safeguard? What are the countermeasures if, God forbid, something happens? And how could we prevent it? And then we monitor those risk priority numbers. That would be part of our auditing mechanisms. We monitor those, and if we see an increase in a risk priority number, we have to respond immediately. So I think as part of yes, we mentioned a lot about contracts, but I just wanted to and contracts are part of the risk mitigation strategy. But I believe that the failure mode and effect analysis is also a very, very important tool, and it can be used on many levels, the product level and the process level, and definitely could be used in terms of supplier interaction, and it could be part of the supplier selection scorecard. Maybe you could put the column with a risk priority number. Right. So in terms of as we're selecting suppliers, it will force us to think in those dimensions, and it will force us to do our due diligence and to investigate those suppliers. And the risk priority number should be very low. Right. And we select suppliers that, in terms of what we would call, again, we're modifying this, what you call social responsibility risk priority number. We select suppliers only that have a low social responsibility risk priority number. So that was my caveat for the day. I like to give you all caveats, but leveraging failure mode and effect analysis, and please do your due diligence and do your research on failure mode and effect analysis, and being innovative in terms of using the tool. Very, very powerful tool to utilize this as part of a social responsibility program, and to also leverage it in your supplier selection matrix and process. So that is the webinar for today. I hope you all enjoyed it, and I was able to give some critical insight as social responsibility. What are some of the issues that exist? What are the tools that we could use or the methods that we could use, the processes that we could use to enable to continue and to deploy a social responsibility program, and how important it is, and to think beyond the cost of it, and how we could look for opportunities in our supply chain to reduce cost and how having a socially responsible supply chain in the first place could reduce cost. That's the other matter. Having a socially responsible supply chain is a mechanism for cost reduction. So I'm going to leave the floor open for any questions. Do we have any questions? Do I have any questions? Oh, I see I have a question here. Hi, Arlene. You have a question for me?
No, I don't.
Hello? Yes, I could barely hear you.
No, I don't have a question.
Okay. Was today's webinar informative for you?
Yes, it was. Thank you.
Okay. If any of you all need slides, you could just let us know and we'll send the slides out to you. Thank you, Arlene. I'm happy it was a benefit to you. Does anyone else have any questions? Any questions on failure mode and effect analysis? For those of you who have been through some of my webinars, I think that was, how should I put it? I went into detail and I actually have a slide for that. Do you have any questions on how this could be used in general in terms of your procurement process, or how could it be used in terms of social responsibility? Any questions on social responsibility cost, on what would it cost to, or would it be cost prohibitive to deploy a program of such a nature? Does anybody have any questions? Okay. Arlene, were you able to hear me clearly, right, throughout the webinar?
Yes, I was.
Okay. Okay, great. So I'm happy that you had a good experience. And were you at last week's webinar?
Yes, I was.
Okay, great. Because we do webinars every week, and I'm happy that you enjoyed this one, and I hope I got the message across that it's it's a lot involved and a lot to think about with social responsibility, and the deeper we go, the more and more things. Once you really get into this and we look at it and we examine the opportunities, it's huge. It's an ocean of opportunities that we would identify. And the more complex our supply chains and our product lines are, the more we are at risk. So it could even force us to think about our product designs. How could we simplify our product designs, but maintain the quality, increase the quality, but simplify them and simplify the way we do things, the way we operate. The more complexity, the more probability you would have for something going wrong. The more actors we have in the supply chain, we have to think about that too, as I mentioned, wherever we can to reduce the amount of hands that we have, or the intermediaries in the supply chain, to reduce wherever practical. We reduce them because it's just all that. It's just more to manage and increase probability of something where something could go wrong. So I'm going to stay online for a couple more minutes in case anybody has any questions for me. But I'm happy that you all enjoyed this It was a retention webinar, and I hope that you all found the information useful and a critical point of reflection on how we do things and how we view our operations. I'm going to stay online for a couple more minutes. Hello, Deborah. How are you?
Okay, I'm gonna just X. I'm gonna quit. Little X at the top. You're leaving the webinar. Yes.
Oh, okay. Do you enjoy the webinar? You have any questions? Hi, Yvonne. How are you? Okay. Alrighty. Again, thank you for attending today's webinar. It was indeed a pleasure and an honor to share some critical insights on supply chain social responsibility and the importance of such an initiative and how it could bring value to your supply chains and your operations and to your organizations and your customers. Thank you very much again for attending. Have a great rest of the day.